Welcome back. Well, we continue our focus on the first anniversary of that disaster that killed 77 people and left many others injured in Marshalltown, Johannesburg CBD. Family members of some of the victims are yet to bury their loved ones a year on. Well, a commission of inquiry into the fire, chaired by Justice Sisi Kampepe, found that the city of Johannesburg and the Johannesburg Property Company were liable for the fire at Usindiso building. Well, we speak now to Socio-Economic Rights Institute's Executive Director, Nomzamo Zondo. Nomzamo, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Hard to believe that a year already has passed. And I think perhaps let's go back to the first reports of that fire a year on, and certainly if there was an expectation that we could see a tragedy as large as what we did.
Good morning, Naledi. I think none of us could have expected a fire that would cost so many lives. And I think in the few months immediately after the fire, those of us who work in the inner city, those who've seen what happens, were of course still concerned. It was only when the gentleman who's now known as Mr. X in the commission said I'd actually set the place alight. That was actually arson that caused this devastating loss. But I think for us as we stand today, a year on, the real questions are: what have we learned? What are we doing differently? And I think, one, we are grateful to have the Commission of Inquiry. We are grateful that, of course, it made conclusions, as you pointed out earlier, about who's responsible for the circumstances that the residents found themselves in, and calling the city of Johannesburg to act appropriately in the future. And I'm hoping that in the course of this one-year anniversary, the city of Johannesburg is able to reflect on what it has been doing and can do differently to make sure that other inner-city residents don't find themselves in such a situation. Yeah,
but and you're right in saying no one could have expected it, but the issue of hijacked buildings, certainly in the inner city, has been a talking point for many years. So one could argue that this was very much a ticking time bomb and something like this was set to happen at some point. Would you agree with that?
I definitely agree, but I think unfortunately there's been a lack of imagination, which maybe first is caused by the fixation with the use of hijacking. Because once you say hijacking, you associate it with crime. And therefore, you feel that maybe law enforcement must run in and solve a problem. But here we're dealing with a social problem. We're dealing with a housing crisis that the city of Johannesburg, in its own policy documents, has foreseen since the mid-90s. Yeah. And in that housing crisis, there is, of course, issues of buildings that have been taken over by criminals. But that's only a sliver of the real problem. The real problem are people who are in unlawfully occupied buildings who don't have access to basic services. There's also at the other end of the problem a small sliver of property owners and people who are in lawful occupation who live in unhealthy circumstances. And the Commission of Inquiry, we hope, will be able to look at this full spectrum and propose solutions that can make sure that, one, the inner city remains a home for many Black people. And I think it's important that we remember that we remember the lives lost in that building a year on. But we also remember that was a pass office. We remember that in our history, that was the place where Black people either got told, you are worthy of entering the city, or you are not, and you must go back to the homelands. And we had hoped that what that would say, both the history of the building and the loss of these 76 lives and the injury and displacement of others, would have said, how do we make sure that Black people live dignified lives in our inner cities? How do we facilitate that? Yeah. And we also hope that in as much as when the fire happened, we saw ministers standing outside the building, we saw MECs, we saw high-level politicians. But all of a sudden, once the media interest died away, their interest also died away. We are not able to know now what the Department of Public Works has done. But of course, in the last week, we've had the minister come out and say hijacked buildings, so many buildings are hijacked. Yeah. But the real question is, what are you doing and what have you done in the last year to support the city of Johannesburg, to support the province of Gauteng, to resolve the issue?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to think about the fact that these were lives. I mean, 77 is just a number, but these were people with families. I mean, you think about the conditions they were living in. At some point, we were hearing about, shacks that were built inside of this building, and so that infrastructure really concerning. But I want to just remind everyone of the numbers: 76 people having died. Of that 76, 57 were positively identified. That means 19 of those people who lost their lives are yet to be identified. This is at least as of June this year. That's a long time. And quite the fire then if we're unable to identify 19 people over just under a year. But I want to talk about what the city really should be doing. I mean, I want to, you've also got to highlight the fact that we then realized that the building was owned by government. And then we saw the Johannesburg property company wanting to sell it to the Johannesburg social housing company. That deal not going through because the social housing company couldn't afford to buy the building. I mean, it's a lot that went on there. What is it exactly that the city needs to be starting with to get this problem under control of hijacked buildings, and particularly those that are under their own balance sheets?
Thanks. I mean, so the first thing, as you point out, the one thing that was surprising about Usindiso was that not only was the city owned, but that the city had been aware of a problem, right? So I think many of us, when we think of how big the problem is that we have this idea that the city does not know what is there, doesn't know what the challenge is. But for Usindiso specifically, they were aware. They'd been pleas for assistance from the women who had lived there lawfully through the NGO that had leased the building from the city. But from 2019, JPC maybe had decided this is too hard to solve as a problem and it walked away. But even in the process that the commission is undergoing now, we're again seeing buildings that are owned by the city of Johannesburg that should be managed by the JPC, but there's clearly a lack of management.
Yeah.
So that's the first place. I think at the level of, if the city is failing to manage these buildings, then it should be seeking assistance, should be seeking support. And if it's really that they're saying it's not, they don't have the competence to do this, then maybe they do need to lean in on the province. They do need to lean in on the National Department of Human Settlements and possibly Public Works to help them with that management problem. But with that being a problem.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. My apologies. Finish your thought. Yeah.
With that being a problem, it might be very hard to manage if at any point you have a lack of knowledge of what you own and to what level. And so our suggestion is, what you should do as standard for any building: one, make sure that there's access to basic services in all of those buildings. Two, make sure that there's fire safety. So in the Commission of Inquiry, we were told that there's meant to be a program and a working project of the emergency management service of the city, which engages inner city residents, helps them make sure that the buildings they live in have a level of fire safety. And we are saying the EMS should be going out to buildings to make sure that the fire hydrants are working, to make sure that there's working fire equipment, to engage with residents about limited exit and entryways. Yeah. Now, as a matter of course, and not decide that actually this one is lawful, so we'll talk to them. This one is unlawful, we won't talk to them. And unfortunately, even a year on, we haven't even had a process where they have actually had those engagements, regardless of whether you are lawful or unlawful. Yeah. And so we would propose, and in fact we had proposed in meetings with them to say, have a rollout of a program where you test the fire safety in buildings. In that rollout, make recommendations and work with residents to make those buildings more safe, right? And then, of course, all along we've been saying, prioritize those that are at risk to life, prioritize them as a matter of urgency and relocate them. Yeah. But unfortunately, even a year on, there is no accommodation to relocate people to. So the viewers know that a week ago, there was a fire in GP's town, and those residents have been moved to tents. But they've been moved to tents, but there was a fire that happened a few months ago, and those residents are living in tents, and they had to live through the winter in tents. And so the real issue is, even if you are able to work with the community to relocate the community, if you don't actually have a place to relocate them to, you are then going back to what the Usindiso building was and saying, as a black person, you have no place in Johannesburg.
Sure.
Which can't be right.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, you know, and I wanted to clarify this. The number is officially 77 people who lost their lives in that fire. That number was updated. Let's talk a little bit about where the opportunities are. Yes, go ahead.
Let me just stop you for a second.
Yeah.
It is 76 because the 77th was a body part of one of the 76. So it is 76 lives that were lost. So it was through the process of DNA they could identify that actually it is 76 and not 77.
Sure.
So that's the right number, 76.
That's a stock picture that you paint there as we, clarify those numbers. But I want to get into this. Where are there opportunities for private sector to get involved, Nomzamo? Because I think about the example, for instance, of what we saw with the Maboneng precinct. Are we then gentrifying and working the most vulnerable people out of the market as we try and bring some tidiness, I suppose, to the inner city? What were the hits and misses, for instance, of that particular project?
And exactly, I think the one thing was from Maboneng, which was formerly a working class, mainly even Zulu population was displaced. And then what happens is that with that displacement is then there's overpopulation in other buildings that are nearing. So actually the overcrowding affects and impacts on other buildings. But there have been good examples that we've seen where property owners who have gotten involved have even gone as far as to say, we'll donate one building in order to make sure the city is able to relocate people. The city has, as of 2021, an inclusionary housing policy, which actually requires that every developer who develops in Johannesburg, not just in the inner city, ensures that 20% of the units that they provide go to low-income households. And we haven't seen the implementation of that project, even from the private sector. So we would be calling on the private sector to provide that assistance. I think at the level of even of expertise, because in the Commission of Inquiry, and I think our experience generally is that the answer is get people out.
Yeah.
And the private sector can tell you that actually they've renovated these buildings. These buildings are not, the answer is not to demolish everything.